Welcome. Oh, wow. It's great to be here back at Microsoft Build with all of you. I'm Daniel Roth, and I'm here with my colleague, Jeremy Likness.
Hello, everyone.
We're both product managers on the ASP.NET team at Microsoft. And we're excited to share with you today all the great new features coming for web developers in .NET 8 for front ends, back ends, and futures. .NET is a complete solution for building modern web applications. With .NET, you don't need to piece together a solution from multiple different frameworks. Whether you're building a beautiful web UI or a native client with powerful backend services, accessing data, .NET pretty much has everything you need right out of the box. .NET is built for security, it's optimized for performance so that you're ready to handle any workload. Now, some of the largest services and apps in the world are built on the trusted .NET platform. And as .NET gets better with every release, those services and apps just reap the benefits. For example, Microsoft Teams. They recently upgraded their permissions service to .NET 6. This is a service that handles 60,000 requests per second. When they upgraded to .NET 6, they saw 30% better input latency, 45% better outgoing latency, and they doubled their server efficiency. Microsoft Bing recently upgraded their high-performance workflow engine called Zap to .NET 7. This is an engine that handles running 900,000 instances, executing 30,000 nodes per second on each machine. They improved their startup time by 40% and P95 latency by up to 7%. The improvements were so dramatic that they actually came to us and said, you know, initially we thought something was broken. We thought we had broken something, but we investigated and looked, and no, these performance improvements were all 100% real. With .NET, you can build an entire web application from the front end to the back end. It's a full stack web framework. Now, on the front end, many applications need to use a variety of approaches in order to deliver the best web UI experience. For example, maybe some pages are best handled from the server in response to requests. So they load almost instantly and they're easily indexed. This is called server-side rendering. And .NET has great support for server-side rendering with frameworks like MVC and Razor Pages. In other cases, it might be best to handle that UI from the client using client-side rendering. So you get rich interactivity and you have access to client capabilities. With .NET, you can build client web UI using Blazor. Now, many apps actually need to use a combination of these two approaches to deliver the best web UI experience to their users. In .NET 8, we're combining the strengths of server and client-side rendering with Blazor's convenient component model so that you can deliver full-stack web UI using a single framework. This is the best of client and server. Let me show you what I mean. OK, so this application, this is a recipe application, and it's built entirely using Blazor. On the home page, you can see that we have a bunch of recipes. And then if we click on one of these recipes, we can see that let me just refresh this page real quick. We can see some details about the recipes. Now, if we go back to the home page, let's take a look at what this app looks like in the browser DevTools. Now, if I refresh the home page, now this is a Blazor app, but if we filter for just WebAssembly, there's no WebAssembly being downloaded for this app. There's no WebSocket connections being set up to run this app. There's not even any JavaScript being downloaded. This app is being entirely rendered from the server using server-side rendering. In .NET 8, you can do full server-side rendering with Blazor. Now, let me show you what that looks like in the code. If we go to the project for this application, let's bring up the components for the home page and for the recipe details page. Now, each of these pages is actually a Blazor component that's set up as a routable endpoint on the server. So as a request comes into the server, the request is routed to the corresponding Blazor component, and it renders a full HTML response in response to that request. So full server-side rendering with Blazor. Now, we can do form handling as well. Let's go back to the app, and I'm just going to search for let's search for all the chocolate recipes. That was a form request right there. Did a GET request, so we can see all the chocolate recipes. Let's pick one. And at the bottom, there's another form here for submitting recipe reviews. Let's give this one a 5-star review. Say it's super yummy, and we'll submit that. And if we scroll back down, we can see the review was added. If we submit this form without any data, we also get form validation working as well. Now, how's that implemented? Let's go back to the app. This is the recipe details component. If we scroll down a bit, we can find that star rating reviews component. Let's right-click and go to definition. And here we can see that we're using the built-in Blazor edit form and input components to render that form. These components will bind the request data, they'll validate that data before then calling your onSubmit handler, all from the server. So we can do full server-side rendering with Blazor. Now, because we're doing that rendering with Blazor, we can now start to enhance the user experience of this app. For example, let's look at navigation. Like when I click on a recipe or go back, that's doing a full page load right now. That's why you might see like a brief UI blip as you navigate. Also, if I go to a recipe and I submit one of those reviews again, you may have seen this before, may have noticed that if I submit that review, I'm actually losing the scroll position on the page as the page loads. We can enhance that user experience by adding a little bit of client-side logic. Let's go back to our code, and let's go find the layout for the application here in main layout.razor. And if we scroll down to the bottom, I'm just going to uncomment the Blazor script, and we'll go ahead and apply that to the running application. Wait for that to apply. There it goes. OK, so now if I go back to the home page, and if I start clicking around, you may notice it's very subtle, but the UI blip is gone. The navigations are now fast and silky smooth. Similarly, if I go back to that form, and let's submit another review. Let's, I don't know, what do we do with the first one? Awesome. Make sure I can spell, and submit that. So the review got added, but I no longer lost the scroll position. How is that working? Well, Blazor is now intercepting the request, like for a navigation request, and the rendering is still happening from the server, but Blazor is then intercepting the returned HTML content and applying it to the DOM without having to do a full page load. Same thing for our enhanced forms. It's intercepting the request and handling the HTML response and updating the DOM seamlessly. So our app starts to feel like almost like a single-page app, like a spa, but it's still doing full server-side rendering. Now, some pages need to do long-running async tasks in order to render. Like, for example, on this recipe page, maybe we need to do a database query to get all these recipes or make an API call. That can delay the rendering of the page, because you typically have to wait for all those tasks to complete before you can fully render the page. Let me show you what I mean. Like, if I go back to the code, let's add it'll be a simulated database call to our recipe app. So here's where we're getting the recipes. And right here, I'm just going to uncomment this task.delay as if we're making a database call that's taking a full second. We'll go ahead and apply that to the app. All right, great. So if we go back to the application, and now if I refresh the page, ready, click, there's 1,000, boop, and then it finished rendering. It's a little easier to see if I navigate to a different page and then back, ready, click, 1,000, then it renders. We're having to wait for that simulated database query to complete before the page renders. We can improve that user experience in .NET 8 using streaming rendering. Streaming rendering will allow the page to render immediately with placeholder content while those long-running async tasks are executing. And then when they complete, the component is rendered again, and Blazor handles, well, streaming the new content on the same response connection and then applying it to the DOM. Let me show you how easy that is to enable. We'll just go to our home page. Let's go back to index.razor. And I'm going to uncomment this attribute to enable streaming rendering true. We'll go ahead and restart the app. Now take a note here. In this page, we have a little bit of logic that if we don't have the recipes yet, so when the page initially renders, we can render just a placeholder content, loading recipes, ... while that database query is executing. And then later, once the database query is completed, this page will render again, and we'll render all the recipes, and then Blazor will stream that down to the client, and it should get seamlessly updated. OK, so as soon as it's done building and restarted, we'll see that in action. Let's see where we're at with the build. There it goes. OK, so we've rebuilt. I'm just going to wait for the browser to pop up. So we'll see streaming rendering coming down to the client.
You got to use the trick, Dan.
Oh yeah,
Clockwise
sorry.
mouse.
Yeah, clockwise mouse to crank the
Speeds everything up.
OK, you may have seen it. It was really quick. I'm going to refresh again. Ready? Refresh. You see loading recipes, ... And then the recipes come in. The page loads instantly with the placeholder content, and then the streamed content comes in later, still rendering from the server, but now we get a much more responsive user experience. Pixels on the screen as fast as possible, and then updated seamlessly. So that's streaming rendering with Blazor in .NET 8. OK. So far, everything we've been doing with this app is still rendering from the server. But now I want to add some rich interactivity to this application. There's another page in this app, which is the submit recipe page. And it has this recipe editor. And I want this to be a more sophisticated UI. Like, for example, I want to be able to upload a picture. Let's pick one of these salads. And instead of just displaying the file name, I'd like to be able to see a full preview of that picture. Also, we have this ingredients list editor where I should be able to add ingredients and edit them and reorder them with like drag and drop. But if I click the add button right now, it doesn't do anything yet. That's because this page is still using server-side rendering. It's not interactive yet. Let's make it interactive. We'll go back to the code, and we'll go find that submit recipe page, which is right here. And we're going to apply a render mode to this page. And we're going to start out using render mode server, as in Blazor server. That means all of the UI interactions for this page are going to be handled over a Blazor server-based WebSocket connection. Hopefully that should make this page now have a nice interactive experience. OK, so we've restarted the app. Let's go back to submit recipes. And now let's try and upload a picture. Let's pick the pancake one this time. There we go. Our client logic is kicking in, our interactive logic. We can now add some ingredients, like maybe let's add some flour and a couple of eggs and, I don't know, a few ducks. Why not? We can switch between metric and imperial units. We can drag and drop. We now have a nice interactive UI within what is still otherwise a server-side rendered app. This is really cool. Like if I go back to the home page, and let's now go back to the browser DevTools. Let's remove all of our filters and refresh this page. OK, so on the home page, do we have any WebSocket connections being established yet? I'm filtering for WebSockets. Nothing yet. But if I browse now to submit recipe, aha. So now we see the Blazor server WebSocket connection is being established just for this page. And then if I leave this page, that connection can be freed up along with all of its server resources. So it's much more efficient. A little island of Blazor server interactivity in this app. Now we can use Blazor WebAssembly too. Let's go back to the app and switch this render mode from server to WebAssembly. We could do that. We'll go ahead and restart the app. Now one thing you may notice is that this app, this is actually building out of the full ASP.NET Core repo. So it's a big solution. But the project is actually just a single project. We don't need a separate project to build for Blazor WebAssembly. And that's thanks to multi-targeting. The same project is being built for both the server and the client. So we get a single project dev experience. OK, so let's see what this looks like now in the browser. Let's bring up the browser DevTools. And, no, not that. Let's go back to the network tab. Remove all our filters. I'm going to also clear out all the site data for this app just to make sure we don't have any Blazor WebAssembly already pre-cached. OK, let's refresh the home page. All right, let's filter for WebAssembly. No WebAssembly yet. But if I browse to submit recipe, aha, so now we're seeing the .NET WebAssembly runtime being downloaded just for this page. And it gets cached, so if we have other pages in this app that need .NET on WebAssembly, they can just use the already cached runtime. So we're able to add interactivity to our application using either Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly on a per component or per page level. That's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. What would be even cooler
Next
level is if we could decide automatically at runtime which render mode to use. Like what if we did something clever where we start off users with Blazor Server, which loads fast, doesn't require downloading the .NET runtime, but we download the .NET WebAssembly runtime in the background. And then we cache it so that the next time the user comes to that app, we can use it instead of having to set up a Blazor Server connection. What would that look like? All right, let's go back to the app, and let's switch the render mode one more time from WebAssembly to auto, okay? Auto render mode. So this is going to allow us to make a decision at runtime, which render mode do we want to use. We'll go ahead and get this building and restarting. There we go. OK, let's bring up those browser dev tools one final time. We'll clear out all our site data so we don't have anything cached already. Let's remove all the filters. Refresh. OK, so on the home page, do we have any WebAssembly? No WebAssembly. Do we have any WebSockets? No WebSockets. Let's go to submit recipe. All right, so now, so we've got the Blazor server WebSocket connection being set up. But if we also filter for WebAssembly, we can see that in the background, .NET.wasm is also being downloaded and cached. Now, which one are we using? Well, we can see that in the browser dev console. We can see that this app currently is running over a WebSocket. So it's using Blazor server right now. But in the future, if the user comes back to this app, let's just refresh the page as if they're revisiting the application. It has now magically switched to use WebAssembly because it sees that the .NET WebAssembly runtime has already been downloaded and installed. That's pretty awesome. Cool. So with Blazor in .NET 8, we're able to get the best of the server and the client using a full-stack web UI experience. It's pretty awesome. All right, let's go back to slides. OK, so in summary, what did we just see? So we are enabling full-stack web UI development with Blazor in .NET 8 with the following additional features. Server-side rendering with Blazor components. Enhanced navigation and form handling. Streaming rendering. The ability to add client interactivity per component or per page. And also the ability to choose which render mode you want to use at runtime. Now, some of these features are already available for you to try out with the latest .NET 8 previews. So you can try out server-side rendering and streaming rendering. The rest, we're hard at work on delivering, and we expect to make available to you in upcoming .NET 8 previews as well. Now, in addition to being able to render Blazor components from the server, we're also enabling you to take a Blazor component and render it completely outside the context of an HTTP request. You can take a component and render it to HTML as a string or as a stream, independent of the ASP.NET Core hosting environment. And this is useful if you just want to generate some HTML fragments. Like maybe you want to generate some content for like an automated email. Or in the future, we plan to use this to enable static site content generation for Blazor. That's not going to come in .NET 8, but this is laying the foundations for that work. Let me show you what this looks like. OK, so if we go back here, and I'm going to actually go to a different Visual Studio instance now. So here we have a very simple app. This is actually a console app. There's no ASP.NET Core in this application. But we're using this HTML renderer API to render a Blazor component. And we're rendering this my component. Here's my component. And it's a Razor file. And it's just rendering a header and the current time. So pretty simple. And then we render it to a string. And then we're going to display it to the console output. Now, the only one little tricky bit here is that in order to render components, you need to do that in the context of a component dispatcher. So that's why we have this invoke async call here that we're wrapping all the render component calls in. Once you do that, you should be ready to go. So let's go ahead and execute this. And there you go. You can see that. Whoop, where'd it go? I just lost it. Did I close it? Oh, my goodness. Oh, my God. Run it again. Run it again. I hit a button. You can see that. You can see there is our component content that's been rendered. And so this is a really nice way to take Blazor components and use them for like some sort of HTML templating. And again, in the future, we hope to use this for static site generation as well. All right, let's go back. Cool. Now, we're also making some really big investments in how .NET runs in browsers on WebAssembly. Whether you run your code on the server or the client, we want to make sure you have the best runtime experience possible with .NET. One of the really great improvements coming in .NET 8 is that we now have partial JIT support with the new JITterpreter, which dramatically improves the runtime performance of the .NET WebAssembly runtime. In our benchmark tests, we're seeing 20% faster UI rendering, and JSON serialization and deserialization is twice as fast with the new JITterpreter. And it's just on by default. You don't have to do anything to get this benefit. We're also taking advantage of the latest WebAssembly specs. So if you're doing ahead-of-time compilation, we're leveraging SIMD, single instruction, multiple data, and WebAssembly exception handling so that you get even more performance when doing ahead-of-time compilation. We're adding support for multi-threading in .NET 8, and it is going to ship in .NET 8. We've been trying to get this out for a couple of releases now. It's definitely landing in .NET 8. We're adding a bunch of improvements to hot reload so that more types of edits are now supported. We just recently announced support for generics, editing generic types and, with hot reload, so that's out already for you to try. Blazor WebAssembly apps in .NET 8 will be fully CSP compatible. That's content security policy compatible. And we're also adding a new packaging format, a web-friendly packaging format for .NET assemblies called WebCIL, so that you can use Blazor WebAssembly in even more environments. We're enhancing the Blazor framework, too, with a bunch of new features. Quick Grid is our fast and functional data grid component that we previewed with .NET 7. We are shipping a stable version of Quick Grid with .NET 8. We're adding support for sections, which is the ability to define outlets for content in your application that can then be filled in later by other components or pages. We've taught the Blazor router how to route to a particular named element. And we've added some APIs in Blazor Server so that you can monitor the activity on your circuits and detect like if they're idle and then potentially evict them if you want to free up those server resources. Lastly, and Jeremy's going to talk a lot about this in just a little bit, we're adding some great improvements to authentication in ASP.NET Core. For Blazor, that means you'll be able to build and customize your identity UI completely using Blazor. Let me show you just a couple of these enhancements. All right, so let's look at Quick Grid real quick. If you haven't seen Quick Grid before, the easiest way to see it actually is to go to our Quick Grid demo site, which is aka.ms/blazor/quickgrid. And this is a Blazor WebAssembly app. It's hosted on GitHub pages. And here is Quick Grid in action. It's a very functional grid built for speed. It's like we can do pagination. That's built in and supported. We can sort our columns. We can filter. Like let's, I don't know, let's look at the Olympic performance of Canada. There we go. It also supports virtualization. Here's another Quick Grid. This one's rendering 22,000 results. But it's doing it with virtualization where it's only rendering the rows that are, and fetching the rows that are currently visible. So as we scroll, those rows are rendered and fetched. But we can still do things like search for, I think this is a medicinal data set, so we can search for like, pain relief or whatever. Yeah, so you can look through that data set as well. So Quick Grid, very, very functional, very, very convenient. Now, if you need every single bell and whistle on a data grid component, we would still strongly encourage you to check out the really awesome Blazor data grid components from the various component vendors. But for something quick, something convenient, Quick Grid is often more than sufficient. So that's Quick Grid. I also want to show you sections. So let's go back to Visual Studio, and I'm going to bring up another project. All right, so this project is defining a section. So right here on the layout, we're defining a section outlet. And it has a name. We're using the name top row because this is going to show up in the top row of our layout. So this is like defining a little hole where we can put content. And then in each of our pages, let's look at like the home page. We're then using the new section content component to fill in that outlet. Here we're using the same name. So on the home page, we're just putting in some static text. If we look at the counter component, here we have the section content, and we're putting in another counter button, like up at the top row. And then in the fetch data component, we're rendering the weather forecast for the next day. OK, let's go ahead and run this. Great. OK, so as you can see, up in the top on the home page, we are rendering home. And then if we look at counter, we've got two counter buttons now, one, the main counter, and then the one up in our little section outlet. And then fetch data, we also are now rendering the weather for tomorrow up there on the top.
And I love that weather, by the way, bracing.
Bracing, ooh, yeah, so it's going to be, get your hats and gloves on. Yeah, so it's very much like section support in MVC or Razor pages, if you've ever used those frameworks. But in this case, now it's available with Blazor using Blazor components. All right, let's go back to slides. OK, so this is a summary of all the things that are coming for front-end developers in .NET 8 with Blazor. Full stack web UI support, what we looked at, a bunch of Blazor framework enhancements, quick grid sections, and a whole lot more. And we're making big investments in .NET support on WebAssembly. So a great experience for building beautiful web UI with .NET. But that's just the front end.
Just half of it.
Doing a whole bunch of work on the back end as well, and Jeremy is going to tell us all about that next. Jeremy, what's happening on the back end?
There is so much happening on the back end. So we've focused a ton on the authorization, authentication, identity management experience. But we've also been working on APIs, and I want to tell you a little bit about those enhancements first before we dive into the auth story. One of the things we've added for those of you using minimal APIs is a new forms handling feature so that you can take the contents of a form and post it to a minimal API, and with an attribute, it'll be able to parse those out and use those. Now, the reason why you do that, JSON payloads are obviously more secure in a more common way, but for things like file uploads, have a well-established pattern in forms. So this will allow you to take those file uploads and process them with minimal API. The other thing that we started back in .NET 7 was we added the problem details service. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a standard way of returning errors from REST endpoints. And with that service, it gives you more control over a very standardized way of sending it back so you can programmatically read that error detail when it comes back. And in .NET 8, we've expanded the surface area. We've added new APIs and gave you more control over what you do with that. What I'm really excited to show you, though, is some of the improvements to the API development experience. So building APIs is something that people do a lot, and projects can get large and complicated. So anything to make that task easier can be beneficial. And so what we've done is we've added a new Endpoints Explorer that lets you easily and quickly navigate all of the endpoints you have defined in a project. In addition to that, we've added support for HTTP files. If you're not familiar with that format, I'm going to show you what that looks like. But it allows you to test your API endpoints without leaving the IDE. You can do it right within, and in a way that you can check it in and share it with your team. We've also added helpful analyzers, and analyzers I think of as kind of a coding partner that's with me as I'm writing code, and it analyzes the code as I'm writing it and tells me if I'm making a mistake or potentially falling into a trap. So as we identify patterns that can be problematic, we add analyzers to solve for those, and I'll show you what that looks like. So without further ado, I want to jump into a demo and show you this. Now, I started out with something a little simple. This is the world's most simple API. You hit hello on the endpoint, and you get world. But that's not actually what we're going to look at. I made something a little more involved. So let me go to index.html. I've enabled static web assets in this project. And a hobby that I took up recently is astrophotography. So I wanted to build a single-page application that organizes my observations, the photographs that I take. So I've got the thumbnails for the images. I can page through. I can go next page, previous page. And I've also found when I share these photographs with people, some people are galaxy people, so they want to see galaxies, so we've got a quick filter for that. Other people are more nebula people, so they like the nebula images. And if I click into this, I get some details about it. One interesting fact about these deep sky targets is that they have their own coordinate system, kind of like latitude and longitude. So because I know where that photograph was taken, I can go to a Microsoft research project called the Worldwide Telescope, which is basically a web-based planetarium. So this is the picture I took down here. If I pass it off to the Worldwide Telescope, it's going to show me exactly where that is located. So that's a pretty cool feature to have that sort of coordinate in space.
But these pictures here, like that's not like NASA taking these pictures. These are pictures you took. Like this is.
These are pictures taken off a deck over a streetlight.
Oh, so, wow.
Yeah.
Those are beautiful.
Thank you. Now, the pictures aren't what's important here. We're looking at web APIs. So let me open up the dev tools. You've seen quite a few of that, or quite a bit of that today. And I'm going to open up this network tab and just take off the filter for Nebula. And you can see we've made a simple request. And this is passing some sort information. It's doing a fetch. If I click on the fetch, we get data back. So that's all straightforward. Now, you've seen some pretty amazing Blazor demos today, but we recognize that many .NET developers are using JavaScript.
There are a few of those too.
Yeah, there are a few of those. And there's a debate between what the best framework is, right? Is it Angular? Is it React? Is it Vue? Is it Svelte? And so I decided to kind of make a cautionary tale of this and write it in pure JavaScript. So I know it's a seldom used framework, but there's one JavaScript file that just uses JavaScript.
Jeremy.js.
Exactly, Jeremy.js. But what's important here is that when I go to my endpoint, it's as simple as awaiting a fetch, going to the endpoint, turning it to JSON. And then when I stood up my application, this is a minimal API that is built from the arguments. I tell it where my database is and where to get my connection string. I add the problem details service that I talked about earlier. I tell it to use static files so that I can serve those web assets. And then here's the easiest endpoint in the world, right? I'm telling it for the route hello, simply return world. So that's a simple one, but I've got more involved ones. You saw that it was /data something. So I've grouped a set of endpoints under data, and we can go to this map deep sky data. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go to definition. Inside this, we can see I've got some strongly typed methods. These are taking advantage of dependency injection. So I get a DB context injected here, and I'm looking for a target, and I either tell you it's not found or I return the target. So that's straightforward. Here's where some of the new experience lights up, though. In the older versions of this, your route was just an ordinary string. So you could have typed anything into it, and it would have been perfectly fine until you actually tried to use the route. One of the things we've done is we've lit up syntax highlighting so that you can see the different parts of the route. As I look at this, I can see the static parts in red. I can see the parameters are surrounded in braces. But we've gone a step further. I can even take this, and if I want to change my constraint, I get that code completion. So it's telling me what constraints are available. So now this is no longer just a string. This is an active route that I can interact with programmatically. The other thing that we did is added some analyzers to help you be successful. Let's say I decided to do something like this. I'm going to add an exhibit, which is what I call one of my target endpoints, to the end. So that's basically saying, here's a parameter called target. It's of type exhibit, which is fine. So let me go ahead and uncomment this parameter here. And what we'll see is that it gets that nasty red squiggly line. Even though this could technically compile, what it's telling me is that for runtime to be able to parse this, it needs to have the try parse method so that it knows how to bind the target. So it's basically telling me now so that I can correct it in development time rather than when it's already been launched and sent out. Now we can add a lot of these endpoints to a project. I'm just going to close this one without saving it. Don't save. And finding those endpoints is easier now with the new Endpoints Explorer. So what this will do is it'll scan the project and give me a view of all of my endpoints. And on these endpoints, I can right-click and quickly navigate to the code, open it in the editor, which is great. But I also have this generate request.
Nice. Oh, wow, yeah.
And this is the one I want to go to, generate request. What does that do? So let me close out my Endpoint Explorer and open up the HTTP file. So if you're not familiar with this, this is a file that allows me to interact with my REST endpoints directly from within Visual Studio. So I've defined a variable at the top that has my localhost address that I'm using for development. And then if I hit play here, it's going to give me back, I hit hello, and I got back world, just to prove it. We'll zoom in, show you that. We've got a list of types here. I can even go out and get a specific target. So that allows me to interact with the API, see the way the data is coming back with that, and it'll actually give me some more capabilities that I'll show in a second. But I want to step back out of code, zoom back into slides, tell you a little bit more about what we're doing in servers and middleware. So to create very robust API endpoints, we've added a bunch of small details and features. One of those is request timeouts. So this is a middleware that allows you to specify a timeout for a long-running endpoint that might be doing a database fetch. Maybe you're depending on another service, and you're fetching from that service. And so you can define this policy, and it'll issue a cancellation token, basically, that you can then deal with. And like all middleware, this is configurable at a specific endpoint or at a group of endpoints, so you have fine-tuned control over how you apply this. The other one is a little bit of a performance, I think, enhancement, and that's the ability to short-circuit middleware. So you might have a middleware stack that includes cores and authentication, authorization, some custom component that parses something and sets something and does something else. But for simple files like robots.txt or a 404 not found page, you don't need any of that middleware. And so this allows you to short-circuit that stack and just send the response directly out. We've had HTTP 3 support in our server for some time now, but what we've done in .NET 8 is turned it on by default. So it's out-of-the-box support. And then last but not least for these features is named pipes. So this is a means of communication between apps and Windows, and it is now possible to open and address and work with named pipes from your Kestrel server, so you can have interop between other applications you've written and that running service, which is pretty powerful. Let's talk about what we've done with authentication and authorization. This is something that you told us was very important for us to take a look at, especially in the scenario of self-hosted applications, single-page apps. So we looked at that experience, and we added several features that we believe will make a big difference and have a huge impact. The first one is client-friendly endpoints for identity management. So if you're familiar with the existing experience, I'll show you how that's architected, but you basically have a server-side solution that you can customize. This gives you everything as an endpoint that you can interface with from whatever component you want, whether it's a SPA application client or a mobile client, for example, that needs to work with identity. For scenarios like mobile that don't support cookie authentication, which is what we do out of the box, we've also added support for tokens, but without the complexity and overhead of configuring a full OIDC server. Now, we've shipped an OID server in the box for some time. That server became a commercially licensed server, so we've removed that to replace it with this piece. But if you still need that full OIDC compliance, that's still available. That's there. It's a great product. It's used by a lot of people. But if you need something simple, then that's what we're providing for you out of the box. This is what ASP.NET Identity looks like in the box. We've got the Identity Manager, which is a set of APIs you talk to on the server to manage identity. We've got an identity store abstraction so that you can use different data stores. And we've got a default implementation out of the box. Now, what we used to ship were the server-side Razor page UIs. What we've added are these endpoints so that your client UI can participate, and that you don't have to build these endpoints yourself, because we know some of you, to create a SPA experience, have been having to stand up and customize that experience. So to show you what that looks like, I'm going to jump back into my demo. And one of the things that I showed you was that each observation has a celestial coordinate. Well, there's also a coordinate I'm interested in, which is where I took the photograph. So I go to different sites, but the problem is most of my observations happen either on my front deck or my back patio, and the last thing I want to do is have someone get the GPS coordinates to my deck. That would just be weird. So what I want to do is protect this behind authentication and authorization so that only I can see my locations and they don't leak for someone else. So if I click on this right now, you can see login check failed, you must be logged in. That's great. So let's see what it takes to add to an application that has no authentication whatsoever. We're going to add these features to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is in my HTML page, I've conveniently hidden this little login box. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove this code so that we unhide it. And then through the power of hot reload, if I bounce back over, we've got the dialog there. So that's great. Let's go into our minimal API. So in my program setup, I've referenced identity. And because I've referenced Entity Framework Core, I need a database to store the user data. So I'm going to go ahead and define that. Now, we've got a base DB context that we ship out of the box. That's the identity context with a base user. And then I'm inheriting that. And all I'm doing is just making sure the database is created. Why? Because this is running in memory. And I don't want to be responsible for storing anyone's credentials, so I want it to just be blown away when the demo is done running. Now that I have that, I can tell the application that I want to use this new identity. So I have to open the connection to my database. I add authorization, so that tells the services we're going to use authorization. And I tell it which DB context we're using to store that identity data. Finally, I tell it I would love these new endpoints, these API endpoints, to be able to work with identity through the APIs. And last but not least on this one is just telling it where to route those endpoints. So I'm putting it under a /identity. So the one thing that I forgot to do and didn't have time to put in was a registration page. Normally I'd be stuck, but fortunately with the HTTP file, I can come over to this side, and with my secret build password, I can go ahead and register right here.
You might have to change that password after this, Jeremy.
Well, actually, it's telling me it's not a good password, so I got some problem details back that tell me I need an alphanumeric character.
Oh, yeah.
So let's add some excitement to this demo and do that right there. And then if we run that, all right, I get an OK response code. So let me copy this password because I don't trust myself to remember it to type it. And the first thing I'm going to do is do a made-up password so that we can assure ourselves that there's no hidden magic that just automatically logs me in. So let's do a login here, and login failed. Please try again. OK, that's perfect. And it would help if I actually had my username correct here, but that's fine. And then let's paste the password in and see what happens. And log in. Successfully logged in. So the code for that, by the way, if we do a search for login, we've got a little bit of UI for that. And then we've got this that makes a call to an indirection of a redirection to another. No. Seriously, this is it right here. The await fetch login, cookie mode equals true. And because I'm using cookies, subsequent requests should just work. So I should be able to come back over here. And if I open up and I look for my personal location.
We're going to see your location?
Well, this is a very, I feel small, cozy venue. I trust everyone here. So it's OK if they see that. I don't think they're going to take it and show it to anyone else. So
Whoa,
there's the.
That is a nice rig.
That's the location. Now there is one problem though. If I come back here and I've already logged in, right? So I've got my HTTP file. I should be able to come up here, and on that personal target, I should be able to do a get. But I actually get an unauthorized. And the reason why is because Visual Studio is not keeping track of cookies for me. So I need to go to a token-based login. So let's log in now. And here I've got a super token, and I call it a super token because it is huge. And we're going to come here and grab this token and Control-C. Then down here I've got a variable that tells me to paste it here, so very user-friendly interface for this demo. We're going to just shave the quotes off the end. Now, what this is saying is do a get and pass that token in the header. So I'm going to hit play, and it gives me back a location. It no longer tells me unauthorized. And I actually used a different target here. So I told you I'd do the front deck and the back patio. So let's see which one this is. And we'll paste that in, and we go to another beautiful site in Chile. OK.
Gorgeous.
And that is what I wanted to share on Auth. I have one more feature on APIs, and that's ahead-of-time compilation. What this allows you to do is compile your APIs into a self-contained executable that has a reduced footprint on disk, has a faster startup time, and reduced memory demand. There is a lot involved with ahead-of-time compilation, so I'm going to leave the details of that to distinguished engineer David Fowler and principal architect Damian Edmonds. They have a session tomorrow that is a deep dive into this feature. So what we talked about were changes to our middleware and our server side. We talked about a client-friendly identity that I would love to hear from you, what you think of that, if it's useful to you, and how we can make that better. And we talked about API productivity, things like turning a simple string into an actual interactive route. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
All right. Wow. That was great. API productivity improvements. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. API productivity improvements. Auth looked awesome. Token-based auth, cookie-based auth. That looked great. If you're interested in learning more about web development with .NET, there are a lot of great resources on Microsoft Learn. Whether you're completely new or you just want to polish up your existing skills, check out the QR code and you'll get on the learning path. There's also an open and friendly .NET community available on all your favorite platforms that you can engage with to get your questions answered. We hope you enjoyed learning about the new stuff coming in .NET 8 today. If you haven't already, go ahead and download .NET to get started on your next great web project. And please try out the latest .NET 8 previews. Let us know what you think. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening.